Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video, and today let's talk about the character of Mrs Jennings from Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. So this has become a bit of a yearly tradition for me. Every Jane Austen July I like to make a video focusing on just one character from one Jane Austen novel, looking at them in a lot of depth and spending a long time picking them apart as a character. Previously I have done videos on Mrs Bennet, Mr Collins and Caroline Bingley from Pride and Prejudice and John Willoughby from Sense and Sensibility, and today we're going to be talking about Mrs Jennings from Sense and Sensibility, who is a real favourite character of mine. This video is going to be absolutely full of spoilers for Sense and Sensibility, so if you haven't read Sense and Sensibility, please do go away now. So, let's talk about the character of Mrs Jennings from Sense and Sensibility, because she is a really interesting character, and she's one who has become a real favourite character of mine the more I read Sense and Sensibility. I feel like the first time I read Sense and Sensibility, I didn't pay much attention to her as a character. She was just a minor character, a comic character. I wasn't that interested in her, but the more times I read Sense and Sensibility, the more I love Mrs Jennings and the more I find her fascinating. So let's talk about her today. At first glance, she appears to be one of those sort of silly older women characters that you get in some Jane Austen novels, a bit like Mrs Bennet. Although, saying that, I will leave my video about Mrs Bennet down below in the description because I have many thoughts on Mrs Bennet as a character, and she is not so silly as she first appears either. But I do feel like Mrs Jennings is an interesting character because at first glance she appears to be quite similar to Mrs Bennet, to occupy a similar role to Mrs Bennet, or perhaps to be kind of one stage further on in life than Mrs Bennet. On the surface, Mrs Jennings is a vulgar, gossipy, silly older woman who, having got her own daughters well married, is now keen to get everyone else's daughters married as well. On the surface, she is a sort of silly, cheerful, but somewhat vulgar side character without very much emotional intelligence, who keeps teasing Marianne and Eleanor ruthlessly about their romantic relationships in a way that causes them pain, and in a way that signifies that she doesn't understand them very well. Neither Eleanor nor Marianne like her when they first meet her. They find her vulgar, and though Eleanor is at kind of like greater pains than Marianne to hide her dislike and to kind of be respectful towards Mrs Jennings, it's clear that neither of them really think very highly of her. But I would argue that there is a lot more going on within the character of Mrs Jennings, and both Marianne and Eleanor, within their character arcs within the novel, do undergo a change of opinion about Mrs Jennings, and part of their character arc is to understand their own misunderstanding of Mrs Jennings. It's not a huge part of their character arc necessarily, but I do think it is important. Yes, she is a bit silly, and yes, she is a bit vulgar. I'm going to use that word a lot in this video because it's a word that's used about Mrs Jennings and because I think it is the most useful word to explain what I mean, but I also kind of don't like it as a word, and it's also kind of like very 19th century and has all of its kind of own like specific 19th century connotations, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Anyway, yes, Mrs Jennings can be a bit silly and gossipy and thoughtless, but she's also a deeply kind person, and even when her kindness is misdirected, like, she still is trying to be really kind. And unlike a character like Mrs Bennet, who thinks mostly of kind of getting her daughters well settled in life in terms of their establishment, Mrs Jennings is practical about these things up to a point, but she also has a great deal of respect for love and kind of combines some of Eleanor's sense and Marianne's sensibility in her approach to romantic relationships, which I find quite interesting. Another thing I find very interesting about Mrs Jennings as a character is that she is an independent older woman, a wealthy widow, in control of her own time and money. She is a rare case of a truly independent, financially stable single woman in a Jane Austen novel. And she's also a lot more significant to the plot of Sense and Sensibility than you might initially think. So let's take a look at Mrs Jennings today. I have many things to say. So first off, let's have a quick look at her role in the novel. I would say that, like Mrs Bennet in Pride and Prejudice or other kind of similar characters, Mrs Jennings does have a comic role within the book. She is funny, she is amusing, she says silly things and she teases people and it's entertaining. She goes about matchmaking for everybody in a somewhat over-the-top way and is very entertaining. As readers, we get good comic content from Mrs Jennings. But she also has an important role in the plot. She She is Sir John Middleton's mother-in-law, Lady Middleton's mother, and she's also related to the Steele sisters. It's through her accidental meeting with the Steele sisters that she ends up bringing the Steele sisters to Barton. That means that Eleanor ends up meeting Lucy and therefore finding out from Lucy that Lucy is engaged to Edward. That is through their connection through Mrs Jennings. And Mrs Jennings' invitation to Marianne and Eleanor to spend the London season with her in London is a really massively important thing for the plot. They go with her to London. There Marianne sees Willoughby again, Eleanor sees Edward and Lucy. Lucy and Edward's engagement comes out. It's really significant for the plot that Eleanor and Marianne are in London and that they go to London with Mrs Jennings. Kind of related to her plot role, she also has a sort of gossip role, and her gossip role is interesting both in kind of giving us like the thoughts of the world and the assumptions of the world, you know, showing us, for example, that Marianne and Willoughby's relationship is too obvious because Mrs Jennings is completely certain about exactly what is going on there. But her gossip also helps move the plot along and gives us new information. You know, she is the one who first mentions to Eleanor that Colonel Brandon has a ward, who she believes to be Colonel Brandon's illegitimate daughter, although she is in fact not, as we learn later. And it's through Mrs Jennings' teasing of the three sisters that she ends up learning from Margaret that Eleanor may have a favourite suitor whose name begins with F. And through various things, this is kind of what leads to Sir John happening to mention that Eleanor may be interested in Edward Ferrars in front of Lucy later on in the story, which then in turn prompts Lucy to share the truth about her engagement with Eleanor, who she is perceiving as her rival, and likewise her gossip about Marianne and Willoughby and her belief in their engagement and her kind of spreading the story of their engagement is one of the reasons why Colonel Brandon kind of hesitates to tell Eleanor the truth that he knows about Willoughby's character. So again, we kind of have this role of gossip in the plot, and Mrs Jennings is of course at the heart of gossip. And another significant role that Mrs Jennings has in the novel, I would argue, is kind of as a lesson to Eleanor and Marianne. They both misjudge her in different ways, and because she is a bit vulgar, they both assume that she is bad. She offends their sensibilities, so they forget to recognise her real true kindness. The way she acts towards Eleanor and Marianne may be teasing and sometimes ill-judged, but she is unfailingly well-meaning and generous and kind towards them. And they do realise that as the novel goes on, and I think that's really important in showing how both of them may be mistaken in their opinions and how both of them have more to learn about themselves and the world. So, what do we actually know about Mrs Jennings as a person? This is the introduction we get when she first appears. Mrs Jennings, Lady Middleton's mother, was a good-humoured, merry, fat, elderly woman who talked a great deal, seemed very happy and rather vulgar. She was full of jokes and laughter, and before dinner was over had said many witty things on the subject of lovers and husbands, hoped they had not left their hearts behind them in Sussex, and pretended to see them blush whether they did or not. Mrs Jennings was a widow with an ample jointure. She had only 2 daughters, both of whom she had lived to see respectably married, and she had now, therefore, nothing to do but to marry all the rest of the world. There's a lot of interest in here, and I think one of the things that I really take away from it is that she is very happy. And throughout the novel, we see that Mrs Jennings is very happy and very good-humoured and kind of generally pleased with everything, which I actually think is quite nice and really admirable, and definitely sets her very much apart from Mrs Bennet, who, you know, in general is not happy, I don't think, or is kind of always in a fluster and waiting for something new to happen and always kind of seeking out things. I think that is partly because Mrs Bennet, you know, is really worried about her daughter's situations, whereas Mrs Jennings, she's got her 2 daughters married and she's just matchmaking everyone else for fun. But I also really enjoy the fact that she's just good-humouredly going about the world having a nice time. Based on the age of Mrs Jennings' eldest daughter, Lady Middleton, who is said to be not more than 6 or 7 and 20, we can estimate that Mrs Jennings is probably in her late 40s or early 50s, perhaps a little bit older, depending on how early in life she got married. Possibly more likely, actually, to be later into her 50s because she is from a slightly lower class than some of the other characters, and in general the kind of higher up the social scales the young women tended to get married earlier. Obviously she is described in the passage I read as elderly, but I do think it's worth remembering that at this point in time elderly had like younger connotations than it does now. She's probably younger than we would call someone elderly today. And let's have a think about Mrs Jennings' social position. I think it's fair to say that Mrs Jennings is potentially a bit of a social climber, or that her husband may have been a bit of a social climber, or certainly that her position in life now is higher than it was earlier on in her life and higher than her husband's was earlier on in her life. We don't know too much about her husband, but we do know this. Though Mrs Jennings was in the habit of spending a large portion of the year at the houses of her children and friends, she was not without a settled habitation of her own. Since the death of her husband, who had traded with success in a less elegant part of the town, she had resided every winter in a house in one of the streets near Portman Square. Later on, Eleanor and Marianne's brother John notes that Mrs Jennings is a woman of very good fortune, and then after he's met her, he says, Lady Middleton is a most elegant woman, such a woman as I am sure Fanny will be glad to know, and Mrs Jennings too, an exceedingly well-behaved woman, though not so elegant as her daughter. Your sister need not have any scruple even of visiting her, which, to say the truth, had been a little the case, and very naturally, for we only knew that Mrs Jennings was the widow of a man who had got all his money in a low way, and Fanny and Mrs Ferris were both strongly prepossessed that neither she nor her daughters were such kind of women as Fanny would like to associate with, but now I can carry her a most satisfactory account of both. What that low way that Mrs Jennings' husband made his money in, we don't know, but presumably he has made his money in trade of some kind. Mrs Jennings and the late Mr Jennings were probably of a kind of similar class to Mr and Mrs Gardiner in Pride and Prejudice, middle class, having made some money, able to send their daughters to good schools and give them the education of ladies. We know later that Charlotte Palmer at least has been away to a good school in town, and the implication I think is that Mr and Mrs Jennings are from the middle classes, have done well in life, and actually if you think about it, Mrs Jennings has done really well for herself within the social system that she lives in. She is from the middle classes and she has had one daughter married to Sir John Middleton, who I'm assuming is a baronet. We're never explicitly told whether Sir John is a knight or a baronet, but from what we do know about him, I can't really see what he would have been knighted for, so I'm kind of assuming that he is a baronet, they were not explicitly told that. Either way, he's a member of the gentry, he owns Barton Park, he seems pretty well off and to be a gentleman of leisure. And then Mrs Jennings' other daughter, Charlotte, she is married off to Mr Palmer, who is again a member of the gentry, he owns the house of Clevedon. The suggestion is that maybe Mr Palmer hasn't been a member of the gentry all that long. His house is said to be modern and to have no park, which suggests that he or his family have brought themselves into the gentry like relatively recently, but he seems to be pretty well off, and he also seems to feel that he is of a high enough class to slightly look down on Mrs Jennings when he perceives that she is being vulgar. I think it's fair to say that Mrs Jennings is a woman from the middle classes whose daughters have married into the upper classes, and that is really interesting at this point in time. Mrs Jennings is a really interesting character to look at in terms of like early 19th century social mobility. And I wanted to talk a bit about her sort of financial independence. We know that she has financial independence, that she's pretty wealthy, her husband has passed away and the money is now all hers, and she spends her time pretty much as she wishes. That passage I read earlier about her going to London every season kind of gives us a bit of a sense of her general life, and as does another passage that I want to read, which is just after Eleanor and Marianne have arrived with Mrs Jennings in London. Colonel Brandon comes to call that evening and Mrs Jennings is late in receiving him, and this is what happens. Mrs Jennings soon came in. "Oh, Colonel," says she with her usual noisy cheerfulness, "I am monstrous glad to see you. Sorry I could not have come before, beg your pardon, but I have been forced to look about me a little and settle my matters, for it is a long while since I have been at home, and you know one always has a world of little odd things to do after one has been away for any time, and then I have had Cartwright to settle with. Lord, I have been as busy as a bee ever since dinner." This is the only mention we have of Cartwright, but I'm gonna assume that he is the butler or equivalent. Regardless, this speech of Mrs Jennings tells us that she runs her own household, that she has a lot of business to attend to the moment she's in town, and gives us a strong sense of her sort of financial and social independence, and her position as head of this household, which is something you don't see from that many women in Austen. And I even really enjoy the way she addresses Colonel Brandon, very much as an equal. She says, "You know one always has a world of little odd things to do after one has been away for any time," in the way as one homeowner speaking to another homeowner, even though he is, for the proper landed gentry, and she is very much not. And I think that's pretty cool. Next, I want to talk about Mrs Jennings' vulgarity, because this is something that comes up a lot in the novel. Both Eleanor and Marianne struggle with her as a person when they first meet her because they consider her to be vulgar. And we are told by Jane Austen kind of frankly that Mrs Jennings is a vulgar person. So the Oxford English Dictionary has the definition of vulgar as lacking in sophistication, refinement or good taste, not considered fitting or appropriate in educated or polite circles. And at this point in the 19th century, what the word vulgar really means in this context is not ladylike, not gentlemanlike. Mrs Jennings is not behaving in the way that is appropriate or in accordance to etiquette within upper class society, and therefore she is considered to be less worthy than those around her. Vulgar at this time, and still I would say, is a word that is hugely charged with a lot of class connotations and a lot of snobbery. Another word used to describe Mrs Jennings is ill-bred. There's one interesting exchange at one point between Mrs Jennings, her daughter Mrs Palmer, and her son-in-law, which I just find sort of fascinating. "You and I, Sir John," said Mrs Jennings, "should not stand upon such ceremony." "Then you would be very ill-bred," cried Mr Palmer. "My love, you contradict everybody," said his wife with her usual laugh. "Do you not know that you are quite rude?" "I did not know I contradicted anybody in calling your mother ill-bred." "Ah, you may abuse me as you please," said the good-natured old lady. "You have taken Charlotte off my hands and cannot give her back again, so there I have the whip hand of you." What a fascinating exchange this is. Mr Palmer is saying that Mrs Jennings has been rude and inappropriate by not standing upon ceremony and not following etiquette, and his wife is pointing out that he is being rude in the manner of his saying so. He then replies that everybody thinks Mrs Jennings is ill-bred, and she just doesn't care at all, because she just doesn't care what anyone thinks, which I kind of think is awesome. We know that Marianne thinks very little of Mrs Jennings. "If the impertinent remarks of Mrs Jennings are to be the proof of impropriety in conduct, we are all offending every moment of our lives. I value not her censure any more than I should her commendation." And Willoughby too is very dismissive of Mrs Jennings, saying of Colonel Brandon, "Who would submit to the indignity of being approved by such women as Lady Middleton and Mrs Jennings, that could command the indifference of anybody else?" And even Eleanor doesn't think very highly of Mrs Jennings, so she takes more pains to hide it. When they are first asked by Mrs Jennings to come to London with her, this is what Eleanor reflects. That Marianne, fastidious as she was, thoroughly acquainted with Mrs Jennings' manners and invariably disgusted by them, should overlook every inconvenience of that kind, should disregard whatever must be the most wounding to her irritable feelings in her pursuit of one object, was such a proof so strong, so full of the importance of that object to her, as Eleanor, in spite of all that had passed, was not prepared to witness. Eleanor is really shocked that Marianne is so desperately in love with Willoughby and so keen to go to London to try and see him that she is willing to put up with the inconveniences of Mrs Jennings. And yes, Eleanor is thinking here about Marianne's opinion of Mrs Jennings, but it's quite clear in this wording, I would say, that her own opinion is that Mrs Jennings's company is an inconvenience too. Later in that chapter, we have an exchange between Mrs Dashwood and Eleanor, where Mrs Dashwood is asking Eleanor what on earth her objection is to this trip to London. "My objection is this: though I think very well of Mrs Jennings' heart, she is not a woman whose society can afford us any pleasure or whose protection will give us any consequence." Which, fond of Eleanor as I am, is quite a mean thing to say. She is not a woman whose society can afford us any pleasure, when Mrs Jennings is so kind to them always. Eleanor and Marianne both dislike Mrs Jennings early on because they consider her to be unladylike, and also because she teases them about their romantic relationships in a way that makes them both uncomfortable. Mrs Jennings teases everyone she knows who is single about marriage a lot, and she teases the young ladies she knows about men often. Mrs Jennings loves to matchmake. She matchmakes Colonel Brandon first with Marianne, later with Eleanor. She teases Eleanor about Edward, and Eleanor and Marianne really object to this. And some of this is about how awkward it makes them feel and the kind of embarrassment and pain that it gives them, but a lot of it is also about the fact that they feel this is too open and improper a discussion to be having in public. Like, even Marianne, who is very public about her affection for Willoughby, it is unspoken, and the fact that Mrs Jennings is willing to speculate on their marriage so publicly is improper and lacks etiquette. Part of why Eleanor and Marianne dislike this teasing is because it makes them uncomfortable, but also part of the reason why they don't like it is because this is against etiquette. It's considered uncouth and unladylike to be so open about promoting attachments in this way. You know, in the same way that Mr Darcy in Pride and Prejudice finds Mrs Bennet vulgar and kind of unladylike in her behaviour, so Marianne and Eleanor find Mrs Jennings. And let's not forget, as I have already said earlier in this video, as far as we can see, Mrs Jennings is a woman from the middle classes whose daughters have married into the upper classes. And a lot of Eleanor and Marianne's dislike of her and her vulgarity is in part to do with different social expectations. Marianne and Eleanor have been raised amongst the gentry, but with their father's death and their relocation to Barton Cottage, they are now in a middle class position. They have fallen in the social scale, where Mrs Jennings has been elevated and has elevated herself over her life, and they disapprove of her behaviour because it doesn't fit with the social expectations that they are used to. Mrs Jennings enjoys teasing everyone, but she's also very good-humoured and quite light about it, and she obviously finds it funny and thinks everyone else finds it funny. Even when her teasing does cause some pain, I don't think she ever intends it to at all. I don't think she is ever laughing at anyone's expense. She's just laughing at young people in general because she finds their romantic entanglements amusing. She says after Marianne has received a letter from Willoughby, "I made sure of its being nothing but a common love letter, and you know young people like to be laughed at about them." And Marianne is decidedly not the kind of young person who would like to be laughed at about a love letter, nor is Eleanor, who Mrs Jennings says this to. But I really do believe that Mrs Jennings thinks that young people like to be laughed at about their romantic relationships. And let's not forget that some characters in this book very much do. Certainly her own daughter, Mrs Palmer, seems very much like the kind of person who would have liked nothing more than to be teased about Mr Palmer during their courtship. And Anne Steele, another young woman who he meets in the book, genuinely wants absolutely nothing more than to be teased about the doctor who is her latest beau. Mrs Jennings, I don't think, is someone with a great deal of emotional intelligence. I don't think she understands or realises that Eleanor and Marianne are made uncomfortable by her teasing or that they don't like it. She thinks they're sort of enjoying it because she enjoys it so much. There is never any ill intention in any of her teasing. I do feel like she does it all with cheerful good humour, thinking that they will enjoy it. One question to think about in light of Mrs Jennings and her constant teasing about matrimony and all her matchmaking is she right to be marriage obsessed? I asked this question when we spoke about Mrs Bennet several years ago. I'll leave that video down below, and I have plenty more to say about marriage at this point in time in that video. But marriage was of such social and economic importance for women at this point in time, especially amongst this class, that it's really no wonder that Mrs Jennings and so many other people are so interested in marriage and so interested in promoting marriage. Yes, her teasing is silly and it causes Eleanor and Marianne a worse pain and at best embarrassment and awkwardness, but marriage was of such vital importance to the life of young women at this point in time that it's really no surprise. Yes, she is being vulgar and ill-bred, but she's also being quite practical in her way. And let's not forget that Mrs Jennings, as Lady Middleton's mother, as Sir John's mother-in-law, must be very aware of the social and financial position of the Dashwood family. She knows that Eleanor and Marianne are young women who have been brought up amongst the gentry in a country estate and have now been transported to a much smaller cottage, living on a much smaller income than they are used to. Mrs Jennings will know that their mother has a very limited income, that the girls themselves do not have much economic stability to look forward to, that they are financially struggling, and she is very aware of how important it will be for the future of these two young women to find husbands. There is a lot of sense in that. And Mrs Jennings is of course also very aware of the own great social rise and economic stability that her own daughters have gained through marriage, and she'd be thinking of that too, and whether she can achieve the same success for the Miss Dashwood who she is fond of as she managed with her own daughters. Mrs Jennings in many ways shows her sense in her interest in marriage and her efforts to promote people's marriage, but I also think she has a lot of sensibility as well in favour of love. She doesn't just talk about marriage and attachments and engagement, she also talks about favourites and hearts, not just marital prospects. And we know, for example, that she's very keen to marry Colonel Brandon off to someone and to find a wife for him. And I think she partly wants to find a wife for Colonel Brandon because she likes to matchmake and because he has a big house and would be, you know, a sort of respectable prospect for a young woman. But is there maybe also a chance that Mrs Jennings wants to see Colonel Brandon married because she knows him and likes him and he's her friend and he's lonely? Because we do see that Colonel Brandon is lonely. I think we do see that Colonel Brandon is unhappy, that he has been unhappy for a long time, that he has been disappointed in life, and that actually finding love might really be beneficial for him. And I also find Mrs Jennings' reaction to learning of Edward and Lucy's engagement really interesting, because I think again this shows the kind of sensibility side of her character as opposed to the sense. It shows that Mrs Jennings, while she's very interested in matchmaking and kind of finding good prospects and good husbands for people, as Mrs Bennet is in Pride and Prejudice, she also, I think, is really like all in favour of love and has a bit of a romantic spirit and kind of wants to see people in love end up happy together in a way that I think Mrs Bennet is less concerned with. I hope with all my heart it will be a match. Lord, what a taking poor Mr Edward will be in when he hears of it, to have his love used so scornfully, for they say he is monstrous fond of her, as well he may. I should not wonder if he was to be in the greatest passion. She goes on to say that the doctor who has told her this news is expecting to be called back because Mrs Ferris will no doubt also be in hysterics and really shocked shocked when she hears of this, as was Fanny Dashwood. I have no pity for either of them. I have no notion of people's making such a to-do about money and greatness. There is no reason on earth why Mr Edward and Lucy should not marry, for I am sure Mrs Ferris may afford to do very well by her son, and though Lucy has next to nothing herself, she knows better than anybody how to make the most of everything. I dare say if Mrs Ferris would only allow him £500 a year, she would make as good an appearance with it as anybody else would with 8. And when later John Dashwood comes to see them and tells Eleanor that Edward is refusing to give up the engagement, Mrs Jennings defends his behaviour, and ill-bred though the defence may be, interrupting John Dashwood as she does, and hurt Eleanor though it does, it's well meant and it comes from good feelings and a belief in letting people who are in love marry for the sake of love. John Dashwood says, "Nothing should prevail on him to give up his engagement. He would stand to it, cost him what it might." "Then," cried Mrs Jennings with blunt sincerity, no longer able to be silent, "he has acted like an honest man. I beg your pardon, Mr Dashwood, but if he had done anything else I should have thought him a rascal." And later when Lucy ends up jilting Edward, Mrs Jennings writes to Eleanor in honest indignation at Lucy's poor behaviour, expecting Edward to be heartbroken and really kind of full of sympathy for him. So yes, Mrs Jennings is kind of in favour of marriage for social advantage and practical reasons, and kind of believing that marriage is, you know, the way the world turns round, as Mrs Bennet does. She's also very in favour of love and of people behaving well towards each other in a way that I think is quite nice and more complicated, I would argue, than Mrs Bennet's views on matrimony in Pride and Prejudice. The next thing I want to talk about in light of Mrs Jennings is her kindness, because above all I think that Mrs Jennings is kind, and also she's very good-humoured and cheerful and sort of willing to take everything as it comes in good part. Her attitude on learning of Lucy and Edward's engagement is one of pure hope and kindness for them, sympathy for those she sees as wronged, and hope for their future. And although she teases Eleanor and Marianne about their possible lovers, she also takes it quite lightly and is sort of forever good-humoured. For example, when she's been teasing Eleanor, when she has imagined that Colonel Brandon has proposed to Eleanor, he hasn't, of course. They're having a conversation which doesn't really make sense to either of them until they realise Mrs Jennings' mistake. But she isn't remotely embarrassed or disappointed to have made the mistake. She's just really amused, which I just think is quite nice. An explanation immediately took place by which both gained considerable amusement for the moment, without any material loss of happiness to either, for Mrs Jennings only exchanged one form of delight for another, and still without forfeiting her expectation of the first. Mrs Jennings isn't remotely embarrassed to have made a silly mistake. She's just entirely delighted that Edward Ferris is going to get a living and going to be able to marry Lucy sooner, as far as she's concerned, and she still thinks Colonel Brandon and Eleanor will probably get married one day, so she doesn't really mind. And I think Mrs Jennings' kindness is especially important when, as I said, she is presented as someone who is potentially a social climber, someone who is vulgar and doesn't know how to behave with the kind of good manners and fine breeding of the upper social class circles in which she moves. But she's also someone who is unfailingly kind, and you can compare that with the other main social climber we see in the novel, Lucy Steele, who is anything but kind. I think a real turning point for Mrs Jennings as a character, by which I don't mean a turning point for her, but I mean a turning point for the reader in the way they see her, is when she invites the Dashwood sisters to London for the season with her. The offer is very unexpected for the Dashwoods, and it's a real mark of attention and favour. It's so kind an offer in a way that John Dashwood manages to persuade himself that maybe this means Mrs Jennings will leave Eleanor and Marianne some money, and she offers to take them to London and look after them for several months, in large part because she knows that they would not be able to afford to go for themselves, and she believes they will enjoy it, and she also knows of the importance for the London season. I think the implication is probably that Mrs Jennings is aware that Willoughby may be in London, and she thinks she'll be reuniting two lovers in Willoughby and Marianne, but I think she also knows how important the London season can be for securing marriages and matches. She is giving Eleanor and Marianne the kind of social opportunity for potential engagements and attachments and marriage, but also opportunity for fun, that she knows they can't afford themselves, and she does it because she enjoys their company and because she can. And when Eleanor is much more hesitant than Marianne, she says, "I'm sure I shall be monstrous glad of Miss Marianne's company, whether Miss Dashwood will go or not, only the more the merrier, I say, and I thought it would be more comfortable for them to be together, because if they got tired they might talk to one another and laugh at my odd ways behind my back, but one or the other, if not both of them, I must have. Lord bless me, how do you think I can live poking by myself, I who have always been used till this winter to have Charlotte with me?" And I really like this speech because Mrs Jennings knows that she is a bit silly, and she knows that she is a bit, like, vulgar, and she knows that her ways may be considered a bit odd by the Dashwood girls, but what a good-natured, like, self-deprecating speech. Mrs Jennings kind of knows she's a bit silly and just doesn't care, and I think that's kind of awesome. I wish I had the unself-consciousness of Mrs Jennings, who just really doesn't care what anyone thinks as long as she's having a good time. And then when Eleanor and Marianne are in London, she is really kind to them, and they find her a much more pleasant companion than they expect. And on their way to London, and once they're there, Mrs Jennings continues to treat them with great kindness. Mrs Jennings, on her side, treated them both with all possible kindness, was solicitous on every possible occasion for their ease and enjoyment. The Miss Dashwoods had no greater reason to be dissatisfied with Mrs Jennings' style of living and set of acquaintance than with her behaviour to themselves, which was invariably kind. Everything in her household engagements was conducted on the most liberal plan, and we're told that Eleanor was pleased to find herself more comfortably situated in that particular than she had expected. We're told very plainly by Jane Austen that Mrs Jennings is treating them with great kindness and consideration, and that Eleanor realises that her opinion of Mrs Jennings may have been mistaken. And then look at the way she behaves after Willoughby lets Marianne down. She is genuinely furious with Willoughby for his poor treatment of her. Well, all I can say is, if this be true, he has used a young lady of my acquaintance abominably ill, and I wish with all my soul his wife may plague his heart out. And so I shall always say, my dear, you may depend upon it, I have no notion of Ben's going on in this way, and if I ever meet him again, I will give him such a dressing as he has not had this many a day. And Mrs Jennings tries so hard to be really kind to Marianne when this happens. We hear of her real concern and great compassion, her attempts to get Marianne wine or delicate fruit or whatever food she might like, because this is the most practical way she can think of to help with Marianne's affliction. And yes, Mrs Jennings is very mistaken to imagine that wine and nice cherries is the way to cure Marianne's depression and misery and heartbreak, but she really is trying, even though she doesn't always succeed. And let's be honest, if Eleanor struggles at times to understand Marianne, how could Mrs Jennings ever hope to? And I really think that Mrs Jennings' insistence on staying at Cleveland during Marianne's illness, because she feels a responsibility for her, despite the fact that she's like just had a grandchild born and that her own daughter is really anxious, like I think that is real proof of Mrs Jennings' real regard and friendship for Eleanor and Marianne. And this is another kind of real turning point for Mrs Jennings in the reader's eyes and also in Eleanor's eyes. Charlotte Palmer tries to persuade her to leave Cleveland with them, but Mrs Jennings, however, with a kindness of heart which made Eleanor really love her, declared her resolution of not stirring from Cleveland as long as Marianne remained ill, and of endeavouring by her own attentive care to supply the place of the mother she had taken her from. And Eleanor found her on every occasion a most willing and active helpmate, desirous to share in all her fatigues, and often by her better experience in nursing of material use. Mrs Jennings may not have all that much emotional intelligence, but there are some areas where she does have a lot of sense, and her good heart always prevails. I'm getting closer towards the end of this video, and I wanted to talk a bit about the kind of arc of the novel. Obviously, I've been mentioning this a bit so far, how we have kind of turning points in how the reader and the characters view Mrs Jennings. Marianne and Eleanor learn to respect and like Mrs Jennings more over the course of the novel, and so should we. Eleanor has that real burst of affection for Mrs Jennings because of the way she looks after her and Marianne during Marianne's illness, and Marianne, towards the very end of the novel, when she's reflecting on her own behaviour, says, "Whenever I looked towards the past, I saw some duty neglected or some failing indulged. Everybody seemed injured by me. The kindness, the unceasing kindness of Mrs Jennings I had repaid with ungrateful contempt." And this is true. That is how Marianne repays Mrs Jennings' kindness, and that she realises it is very important. I feel like there is a really fun character arc around Mrs Jennings in Sense and Sensibility, because it's not that Mrs Jennings has a character arc herself. She doesn't change at all. In fact, we know at the end of the novel that she's going to go on matchmaking for Margaret, and presumably for her own grandchildren in time as well. When Marianne was taken from them, Margaret had reached an age highly suitable for dancing, and not very ineligible for being supposed to have a lover. Between Barton and Delaford, there was that constant communication which strong family affection would naturally dictate. Mrs Jennings becomes a valued part of their wider family group, and while she doesn't change as a person, Eleanor and Marianne's sentiments towards her change considerably. They come to understand her a lot better, and they come to have respect for the kindness of her heart, even though she may not follow etiquette or be as polite as they are. Of course, this is a relatively minor thread in Sense and Sensibility as a novel as a whole, but I do think it's a really important one, and I do love Mrs Jennings as a character. I feel like often in these Let's Talk About videos focusing on one Jane Austen character, I have in conclusion to say that like there are lots of different ways you can look at a character, or there are lots of different sides, but to be honest, when it comes to Mrs Jennings, I just love her and I think she's great, and I just think she's quite underrated and much more interesting than maybe she might appear on the surface on a first read. So I mostly just wanted to have a chat today about Mrs Jennings and how much I love her, and I think that is all I wanted to say in conclusion. So thank you very much for watching this video. Do let me know down in the comments what you think of Mrs Jennings, and that's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video. It's very, very warm today. I'm just gonna wave my fan in my face like a true Regency lady.